For today's Invisible Histories talk, it's a big welcome to Chris Hall to speak on his new book, The Nurse Who Became a Spy, about the remarkable nurse Madge Addy, who fought fascism in Spain and France, 1937 to 1944. The library's events are, as usual, free. However, we would like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so, and there's a donate button on our website. Chris, many thanks. Over to you.
All right, thanks very much, Lynette. And obviously, thanks to the Working Class Movement Library for inviting me. If I'm listening to any speaker, one of the first things I want to know is a little bit about the speaker. So just a little bit, I'll indulge you by telling a little bit about myself. I've always been interested in history from a child. When I was a child, I was interested in the English Civil War, and in particular, the floppy-haired ones, unfortunately. As I got older, Cromwell became more of a figure, and also liked ancient history. Now, my grandfather was beaten up outside Stoke Town Hall by Oswald Mosley's black shirts in the 1930s, and he told me the story, but he died when I was 14, which is a long time ago. And at the time, I didn't really understand what he was trying to tell me. And to be honest, I read my first book on Spain when I was 30, and it was The Concise History of the Spanish Civil War by a person called Gabriel Jackson. And there are two things that intrigued me. One, they mentioned an organized anarchist movement, which I thought was a contradiction in terms, but yeah, I found that quite interesting. And the other one, they mentioned the international brigades. And I thought, wow, who are these individuals that volunteered to fight in somebody else's war, and they weren't being paid huge amounts of money? So I thought, okay, I'll have to do further research on this. And to be honest, that's become almost like a lifelong obsession, to be honest. And I buy almost anything and anything I can find on the International Brigade. Like Lynette, I'm a librarian by profession, also a trade unionist, and I've been interested, say, in Spain for a long, long time. Originally from Stoke, married with 2 children. I think that's enough about me now. I'll move on to tell you what I'm going to talk about today. 2 main aspects, to be honest. I'm going to tell you obviously about Madge. That's probably the main reason why you're here. So yes, I'll tell you about the life story of Madge Addy in a précis version. But what I think also is a fascinating story is how I actually found the information. It was incredibly difficult. So I'd like to tell you the story, and there were some amazing coincidences and bits of luck on occasions that helped me to sort of put her all together, so to speak. Now, Madge was born in 1904 in Chiltern Medlock. She spent her childhood in Rusholme and in Hume, and went to secondary school in Hume. She was the second youngest of 6 brothers and sisters. Her parents were working class. Her mother was nicknamed Red Mary, but we couldn't find any other information about her political reasons for being called that, but maybe she was a major influence on Madge's later political stances. Her father was a skilled textile worker who roamed around Cheshire, Lancashire and Yorkshire. He was what's called a reader, and he would actually repair the reeds in the various textile machines. Madge, in her late teens, decided to train as a nurse, and she trained as a nurse at Hope Hospital in Salford. Now, when she arrived in the 1920s, it was still a hospital for the destitute. It only turned over to being a general hospital by her final year there. And it seems that the training she received was quite detailed. She did everything from theatre work to sort of general nursing. She qualified as a state registered nurse and became a district nurse, although she didn't do that completely. There were sort of gaps. She worked for some care homes. She did other work. We do have a report after she left Hope Hospital of what sort of nurse she was. She gets a good report from the inspector, and it also lists other skills. And these are quite interesting for a later life. One says she can ride a bicycle, which is nothing special, but the other one said she could ride a motorcycle. Now, for a woman in the 1920s from a working class background, that was quite rare. So maybe there was something in Madge already that she was going to do something remarkable with her life. She moved back to Hume, and there she fell in love with her next door neighbour, a guy called Arthur Lightfoot, who was an electrician for Manchester Corporation. and they married in Hume Registry Office in 1930. By then, her mother was dead. Mother died when she was in her early 20s, and her father had died when she was quite young. So she'd almost been brought up as a single parent household. In 1932, she moved to Chorlton cum Hardy, where she lived at 34 Manchester Road, which anybody knows Chorlton is opposite the Co-op funeral parlour, and it was a huge cinema at one time, and not far from the Chorlton Library. There, she had a chiropody business from the front room, which she ran. She might have done hairdressing, but we think that was just a nice story that fitted in with some of the newspaper coverage a few years ago about Madge, because there's a news agent there, Amy Shaw's. But she definitely was a chiropodist. She had a couple of dogs, a couple of lodgers, and a husband in 34 Manchester Road. And she stayed there until 1937 when she went to Spain. Now, because Madge was never interviewed, we don't know exactly why she decided to go to Spain. We do know that her marriage was childless, and whether that was having an effect on their relationship. It does seem they were estranged by 1937, and that might have been a reason why Madge decided to go to Spain. I mean, she would have been able to read newspapers, all the different newspapers at Chorlton Library, which was close by. She might have seen newsreels from the local cinema. Also, one of her brothers was in the Left Book Club, so there were definitely a few volumes on the Civil War in Spain from that time. Also, we know she attended a large Aid Spain meeting at Stretford. If anybody knows the Quadrant Public House, it was in the circle up there, the square in the middle there. She eventually went to the Aid Spain office in Manchester, and they agreed for her to go to Spain as a medical nurse. Now, I'm certain most of you know, but I'll give you a very brief, if you like, causes of the Spanish Civil War for those who don't know. Basically, in 1931, the Spanish monarchy had been overthrown and Spanish Republic came into play. In 1936, very early, what was called a Popular Front of Socialist, Communist, Liberals won the general election and became the new government, although the Socialists and Communists took no part in the government. It was just a Liberal government. Generals, right-wing generals led by Franco, with probably half to two-thirds of the army, rebelled against the elected government, and with support from fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, then rebelled against the government. And throughout the Civil War, arms were openly supplied from Italy and Germany to the rebel forces, whereas Britain and France introduced a policy called non-intervention, which meant the Spanish Republican government was starved of aid. They ended up getting their aid from the Soviet Union because they were the only ones that would actually sell them arms. Now, during the Civil War, Madge was there from mid-1937 right to the very end. In fact, she was the last nurse to leave Spain. She started off being a nurse in a variety of small hospitals. She also helped refugees from areas which the nationalists had overrun. But her main job in Spain was in a hospital at a place called Ucles, which is just south of Madrid. And there she was the head nurse at the hospital. And she also ran a ward called the Manchester Ward. And in the book, you can see there's pictures that quite clearly say Manchester Ward on the wall. And it was a ward that was financed, obviously, by money raised from the people of Manchester. So money from Manchester went to this particular hospital and supplied bandages, medical supplies, ambulances, that sort of thing, as well as the upkeep of the ward. In Spain, Madge was wounded. She was traveling to Valencia with two wounded nurses, and there was a bombing raid, and her arm was broken by shrapnel. She returned to the UK briefly, obviously to recuperate, where she also did fundraising demonstrations and talks for Aid Spain to obviously, again, raise money. She returned to Spain and stayed there to the bitter end. In March 39, the Civil War ended, and she was still at Ucles Hospital when the fascist forces overran the hospital, and she was taken to one side by the new hospital administrator, who was from the fascist Falange. And this noble woman addressed Madge. She couldn't understand why an educated woman would be nursing for the Reds, as she said. Madge then spent several months in Franco's Spain trying to get out. And eventually she managed to get out through San Sebastian and back to the UK, in June of 39. Now in Spain, Madge did fall in love. She fell in love with a Norwegian volunteer called Wilhelm Holst, who had originally served in the German Thalmann Battalion, which was an international brigade unit of anti-fascists. And he eventually rose to the rank of major and became the major contact for foreign aid, well, the medical aid to Spain. Madge and him seem to have had a relationship, and they planned to marry in Paris in about a year's time. We have one letter that Madge wrote in which she talks about divorcing her husband and hoping that the English legal system obviously will move fairly swiftly. That's one of the main interests in Madge, is that she was never interviewed, so we don't have an account of her time in Spain, but we do have lots of letters that have survived. And these are in the Marx Memorial Library at Warwick University, and you get a real feel of what it was like in wartime Spain. A lot of them obviously for propaganda purposes. She wants to raise money, and she gives quite often lists of what she wants. And this can be anything from sort of like crutches, food, bandages, to really detailed information about what type of ambulance she wants, what make, what sort of size engine it should have, and all that sort of thing. So quite a remarkable woman. When she returned to the UK, she became a member of the Spanish Medical Aid Committee. Now, this had supported medical aid throughout the Civil War. And after the Civil War was over, it continued because hundreds of thousands of Spanish Republicans had fled to France and were being kept in concentration camps in France after the Civil War. So Spanish Medical Aid was sending money to help them and sending volunteers out. Now, Madge was probably the only, I'd say, layperson to get on the Spanish Medical Aid Committee. It was full of MPs, lords, trade unionists, very senior people. But she became their expert on post-war Spain, or post-Civil War Spain. And she wrote a report which was given to the Foreign Secretary and to Neville Chamberlain. What was done with that report, I don't know. It doesn't say. She only spent a few months in the UK just before the Second World War. She then left for Paris. And there she joined up with her lover, Wilhelm Holst. He was in Paris with his two sons from his first marriage, and they were training to go to the Sorbonne. Now, during this time, or very early in their time in Paris, Wilhelm Holst made a tragic decision. He knew war was coming to France, that the Germans were going to invade, and so he sent his sons back to his wife in Norway, assuming it would be safer there. They were 15 and 17. Both of them joined the Norwegian army, and when the Germans invaded, both were killed in an atrocity. Not surprisingly, Wilhelm Holst became one of the earliest British agents in France, obviously opposing the Nazi regime in France. When Madge returned to Paris, also went to Paris with Wilhelm. Wilhelm was a Quaker, and he had lots of contacts with Quaker organizations and relief organizations, and in particular, he was helping the Spanish Republican refugees. So Madge obviously worked alongside him doing that. Now, when the Second World War broke out and the Germans invaded, it became obvious that Paris was going to fall to the Germans. So Madge and Wilhelm up sticks and moved south to Marseille. And this was obviously to avoid German occupation. In Marseille, they were in what was known as the Vichy zone. So northern France and the Atlantic coast of France was occupied by the Germans. The southern part of France was a German puppet regime led by a man called Marshal Pétain, a First World War hero of the French. And Madge and Wilhelm were in that zone there. Now, when they arrived in Marseille and got themselves a flat, they found thousands of Allied soldiers, French, British, pilots, soldiers. What had happened is those who had not managed to escape via Dunkirk had gone to the south of France to avoid the Germans. So in Marseille, there were thousands of soldiers milling around. Now, there was an officer called Ian Garrow, who was in Marseille, and he decided to form the first of what was known as escape lines. And this idea was that he would get British soldiers and airmen over the Pyrenees into Spain and then out through Portugal, which was neutral, or through Gibraltar, obviously, which was owned by the British. So the idea was to get soldiers, and particularly pilots, because they were highly trained, back to the UK. Now, this involved organising what we call safe houses, and Madge's flat became one of the first safe houses for British soldiers to be hidden prior to being taken to the border and then over to Spain. Now, what was known as the Garrow lines stretched from Belgium in the end right the way down to the border and then over into Spain. Now, at first, Garrow, who actually lived with Madge and Wilhelm for a time, was undetected. And it seems very unusual that he wasn't detected. He spoke French very well. I mean, that wasn't a problem. His French was excellent. But he was very tall, much taller than the locals, spoke with a very strong Scottish accent, and had a strange walk, a strange gait, as I think as Madge says. And eventually, yes, he was captured by the security forces. And Madge, probably rather recklessly, visited him in prison. And it seems, although she didn't take part in what was an incredible rescue, she must have passed information on to the rescue team. He was rescued. They dressed him up as a policeman and managed to get him out of the prison. And then they managed to dash him through to the French border, and he escaped over into Spain and then spent the rest of the war in the UK. Now, the person who rescued him was called Patrick O'Leary. Now, Patrick O'Leary wasn't an Irishman. He was actually a Belgian called Albert Grez. And he joined Garrow in expanding the escape line so that thousands of British escaped rather than 10s and 20s. Absolutely fearless man who eventually, unfortunately, was captured by the Germans and tortured. I'll just give you two brief examples of O'Leary. And again, Madge had links with O'Leary. He was on a train in France with two British airmen who couldn't speak French. And the train was very, very crowded. German soldiers sat down next to them. And O'Leary had brought them beers to try to calm them down. One of the British airmen, being flustered, knocked his beer all over the German. So O'Leary leaned over to the German and said, "Would you like another beer?" The German thought this was absolutely hilarious, hugged everybody, agreed to have the beer. And I suppose the O'Leary was supposed to have quipped afterwards, "Don't tell me the Germans don't have a sense of humour." And then another incident, there was another Marseille woman, originally from New Zealand, called Nancy Fokaya at the time. She later became more famous as Nancy Wake. She'd been imprisoned by the local security forces, and they didn't know who she was at the time. They didn't realise the Germans were after her. And O'Leary marched into the local police station and said that he was her boyfriend. And they hadn't got any papers or anything because he didn't want her husband to know what was going on. There was lots of nudge, nudge, wink, winks and so forth. The police thought this was hilarious and released her to O'Leary. And then O'Leary immediately got on a train and then over to the border, over the Pyrenees, and then away to safety in Britain. Nancy Wake actually returned to France as what was called an SOE operative, a special overseas executive, and led thousands of resistance fighters. And the resistance people who had been interviewed said she was worth 10 men in any fight. She was a truly remarkable woman. Madge, during her time, she changed from being what was called an amateur resistor. So when they decided to resist the occupation forces, she did it without any backup from the British whatsoever. So it was just done on her own initiative, if you like, and others in Marseille. So that immediately things like making their flat a refuge for British soldiers. They knew if Germans or Pétain's forces found hidden British soldiers in a flat, that was almost certainly concentration camp at best, torture and execution at worst. So she knew the risks she was taking, till eventually by 1944, she was what was known as a P2 agent, which is a full-time agent employed by the Free French. She also worked with MI9, and she also worked with the SOE. She had two code names. One was Mrs. Oates, which she used on her passport, and on her passport she was down as Norwegian. And the other one was Billette. She was part of what was called two networks. One was called Billette and one was Alexandra. Now, a network consisted of about 6 people. men and women. And what they would do, it wasn't so much a combat unit, it was more a communications unit. So they would pass messages on to different resistance groups. They would pass money on to resistance groups. Sometimes they would exchange weaponry, all done very, very secretly. Now, Madge was second in command in both these units. And when Holst, who was her partner who became ill, she actually took over the Alexandria network for a time and led that one. She was also a courier. Now, what a courier did is she went to Marseille airport and used to fly to Lisbon, which was neutral. But it was also a hotbed for German and British spies. They were all milling around in Lisbon. And she would go on a commercial flight. Usually it was a Lufthansa flight, which obviously was a German flight. She could speak German and Norwegian and French. And she used to wear a fur coat and pretend to be a rich Norwegian woman who was going to Lisbon for the better air quality and to go to a spa. And she had in the fur coat masses of messages and money sewn into the lining. And then when she arrived in Lisbon, she went to a hotel where she met a guy called Donald Darling, and he was head of MI9 in Western Europe. And there she would pass the messages on, wait for a couple of days. He would then give her new messages, new lots of money, and then she'd fly back to Marseille and continue again. Now, those flights would contain off-duty German soldiers going on leave to Lisbon to get some sun. And again, if she was captured, almost certainly she would be in serious trouble. Now, for her wartime performance, if you like, she was awarded the OBE by Britain and the Croix de Guerre by the French. She was also involved in a second escape line, which was known as the Pierre-Jacques line. Now, this one was not like the Garrow O'Leary one. It was for SOE agents who were either compromised, i.e. the Germans were onto them, or basically cracked up or were exhausted and needed to get out of France. And so she set that up with a Dutchman called Guido Zembesch-Schrev. And through him, she met a guy called Torkel Hansen, a Danish SOE operative, who became her third husband. It does seem when in danger, Madge tended to fall in love as well as to, as we say, do remarkable things. She, by the time 1944 came, herself and Holst had become estranged. Now, Wilhelm Holst was a remarkably brave man, but he was also a businessman. So in the Second World War, he did some remarkable things and helped the Allies in masses of different ways, but he did make a lot of money. And one ways he made money was with a known collaborator who helped to build the Atlantic Wall with slave labor. Holst's excuse was that he got very useful information from him for the resistance. So maybe Madge, just couldn't stomach that anymore. And by 1944, they're living in different flats in Marseille. Her and Torkel attended a reception in Paris for the Danish King and Queen. And in 1955, they'd moved to London and were married. Torkel died in 1966 from exertions of the Second World War. When the Pierre-Jacques line was infiltrated by the Gestapo, he had to go backwards and forwards over the Pyrenees in all weathers to actually warn agents and destroy documents, and that basically wrecked his health for the rest of his life. So he died in 66 from lung problems. Madge died only 4 years later in 1970. She was just 66. And very sadly, she died from alcohol poisoning. She choked on her own vomit. It's very likely that probably living alone and with possibly a boring life, she became an alcoholic. I say a very sad end, but obviously a remarkable life. Now, very briefly, I'll tell you about the book and how it came about. The first time I knew about Madge from reading various books about women in the Spanish Civil War. I knew she was a nurse, but an academic wrote an article about her in the International Brigade Memorial Trust magazine. And she mentioned two things I didn't know about. One, that Madge had been involved in the Second World War. And the other thing, that she was born in Chorlton-cum-Hardy. So I thought, wow, that's great. I'll get a plaque. I shall have a campaign to get a plaque for Madge Addy. So that was my initial premise. The first thing I did, I started doing some research and I got a birth certificate and found out she was born in Chorlton-on-Medlock. So that was, oh no, what do I do now? So I went through the electoral records and found out she lived in Chorlton-cum-Hardy from 32 to 37. So that was okay. We found a place of residence. It was now obviously raising money, get the councillors to agree. And we got that. We raised the money. It was great. We had the plaque was unveiled 4 years ago. It's on 34 Manchester Road. And we had a reception and an event. Local MP, Lord Mayor turned up, councillors, etc. And in the reception afterwards, I was asked, you must write a book about this woman. She's a remarkable woman. And obviously, because it was a great day and had a good time, I said, yeah, of course. And to be honest, when you see how difficult it was to find information about her, maybe I should have been a little bit more cautious. So I decided to write a book about Madge. And basically, when you're writing a biography, you have to have certain blocks in place. For example, you need things like family documents, or the various things relating to a life available to you. Did the person write a diary? Is there any interviews with that person? Has there been previous things written about that particular person? Any newspaper articles, journal articles, photographs, letters? All these obviously help you build a picture. And then there's the usual thing, birth certificates, marriage certificates, that sort of thing, census, electoral registers. So what were the problems of writing a story about Madge? She'd never been interviewed. She died before it was in vogue to sort of record people who had been in the International Brigade. Absolutely everything linked to her had been lost. So when she died in 1970, there was all her goods, medals, ephemera were sold at an auction. Now there has been 2 auctions since, and I managed to find the last auction, and I contacted the auction house, but they only sold the medals. Where the ephemera is gone, including she wrote an account in the summer of 39 about a time in Spain, that was lost as well. She had no children, so there's nobody to actually pass any documents to. She also existed under a massive different names. We've got the code names, Mrs. Oates and Billette. Her full name is Margaret Nurse Addy, but she tended to be called Madge. But also, she was obviously Madge Hanson and Madge Holst. So there was, and various combinations of those names. So there's about 12 names to look for. I knew of a handful of pictures about her. The only sort of famous picture was one of her giving a blood transfusion. It was on the front of the Daily Worker. That was about the only picture I really knew about. And I did know about her letters, but that was about it. So when I started, the information I had is I knew she lived in Chorlton from 32 to 37. I knew she had 3 husbands and I knew their names. I knew she'd been a nurse at Uckley's and I knew where that was. I knew about her letters at Marks Memorial Library and Warwick. I knew about 2 pictures in the Daily Worker, and I got a picture of her medals from the auction house. And Angela Jackson's article that said she'd done something in the Second World War. Other than that, I was utterly clueless. I didn't know how to proceed. Now, I have written previous books on the Spanish Civil War, so I was confident of finding and doing a good job on a time in Spain. But on the other side, I thought, well, what can I do? Now, I got agreement from 2 other people to join with me. So there's a guy called Andrew Simpson in Chorlton-cum-Hardy, who's a very good local historian. So I was going to get him to write Madge in Manchester before she went to Spain. And he said, yeah, he'd be happy to do that. And then I got contact from a Norwegian guy called Ollie Klebb, who was the grandson of Wilhelm Holst. And he said, yeah, he'd be happy to do the Second World War. So I thought, great, the 3 of us can do this joint exercise and it'll be great. Unfortunately, both of the other gentlemen had to drop out. Andrew got bowel cancer, so I can honestly say that that was a very, very legitimate reason for dropping out. I'm happy to say he's recovered and doing very well. Ollie was doing his own book and so dropped out. You can see this here. This is actually a Norwegian book about his father, Wilhelm Holst, and that's Madge with Wilhelm Holst in 1940 in Marseille. So not surprisingly, he dropped out to do his own book, but both of them sent me regular emails and sort of tips on where to find information. And to be honest, that was invaluable support. Now, I had 3 remarkable breaks. First one was when the plaque was unveiled, I did a very brief Granada Reports slot for 5 minutes on a Thursday night before the plaque. And watching at that particular moment in time was a woman in Cheadle Hulme called Jackie Nixon. And she was watching it and she rang her dad up. And he said, "You must watch this, Dad." He watched it and then they contacted me. Her dad was Robert Addy, who was nephew to Madge. So they rang me. I went down, interviewed them. They got loads of family pictures from Madge, childhood, parents, when she was a nurse at Salford Hope Hospital, and even a pet Alsatian, and the will she signed before she went to Spain. So that was great. So I got lots of information about her early life and some very valuable photographs. Now, I've mentioned the second one already, Ollie Klebb. Ollie had heard about the plaque and he emailed me and said, "I'm Wilhelm Holst's grandson." We met in London at the National Archive, and he'd been doing lots of research on his father, who has 2 files in the National Archive. And he said, "You must look at my dad's files because there's lots of mentions of Madge in there." So I took his advice. I did that. There was loads of information, and also a picture of Madge as Mrs. Oates. So that's the first time I'd actually seen her as a Second World War, if you like, agent. Also, I had a look at Torkel Hansen's file, and there was the only picture I've been able to find of a third husband. Ollie also went to Paris, where there's the French Resistance archives, and he took lots of photocopies of anything to do with Madge from the Paris archive. So again, that was particularly useful for the different networks she was involved in. And also they managed to discover the flat in Marseille. So they took a picture of that and again sent that to me. So that was absolutely valuable support. And the last one I think is probably the most remarkable of all. I have a friend called Mike Arnott, a Scot, who every year goes to a place called Tarracon near Madrid. And at Tarracon, 2 things happened. One, a lot of Scottish volunteers who had been wounded at the Battle of Jarama were treated at the local hospital, and many died. So Mike, being a Scot, had raised funds, and there was a plaque in Tarracon to the Scottish dead. Also, there'd been atrocities committed by Franco's forces after the Civil War. So together with the local village, they had a plaque to their own dead from the Civil War, and they combined the 2 into one event every year. So one year, Mike said, "Oh, I'm going to Uckley's. Would you like some pictures?" I said, "Oh, yeah," because obviously copyright-free pictures is great for any author. You don't have to pay any money. So he went, took some pictures, came back, and he said, "Oh, I'll send you the pictures, Chris." And then he said, Uckley's was shut. So I thought, oh, no. So he got 2 pictures to the outside and one of the front door, which I asked for. They were good pictures, so I was able to use them. And then he said, "I've been talking to a local historian called Maximo." I said, "Okay." He said, "He'll email you in 2 days' time." And in 2 days' time, Maximo contacted me, and then these pictures kept arriving. There must have been about 20, 30 of them. And they were Madge from Uckley's during the Civil War. What had happened is the village doctor at Uckley's had taken thousands of pictures of the hospital and hidden them in the rafters of his house all the way through the Franco period. And only after Franco was dead did he bring these pictures out. And even now, he was only beginning to distribute them to various people. So obviously I had to find out who owned the pictures, and basically it was the grandson of the village doctor, and I got permission to use the ones that relating to Madge. So that was an absolute godsend, because we've got very little other than that. And it included the original picture of Madge giving a transfusion. I'd like to conclude my talk briefly just to say Madge's story is a fantastic story of, to be honest, international opposition to fascism. And what I think is very fitting is the book I've written could not have been written without international cooperation. I've got cooperation from France, from Norway, Scotland, Spain. So I think that fits in really fittingly with the subject matter. And obviously, the very last thing, obviously got to plug the book. This is the actual book here, Nurse Who Became a Spy. You can get it from Amazon. You can get it from Pen and Sword, the actual publishers. Also Chiltern Bookshop. I'll give a mention to our local bookshop. And it's also available in Kindle if the hardback is too expensive. So thank you very much. Obviously, I'm happy to answer any questions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Chris. What an extraordinary story, and extraordinary story of Madge, but extraordinary stories all round. There's any number of other byways you could go down there for the other amazing people involved, extraordinary women particularly, but
they do stand out in the story.
The photos in the rafters is another amazing one, isn't it? Gosh.
It is.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions or comments. Does anybody want to wave at me and say anything? I'm not sure if that's a wave or a no. Now some people I can't see you, but so if you want to put your hand up or put something in the chat, then please do. We have Alan saying an absolutely compelling presentation. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Yeah, I think you were Marshall. Yes, I would expect nothing less. Please go ahead, Marshall.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Chris. Hello.
Hello, Marshall.
An author question, if you like. You said that the resources that you had to work on were difficult to find, and in the end are still fragmented, I guess, to some extent.
Totally,
so the question is, how did you get inside her head? If she didn't leave reflective type of material, talk, were there any points where you could begin to say she felt, she thought, this is why?
Good question, Marshall. I mean, obviously, in some cases, there had to be some educated guesswork. I mean, without a doubt, I'd have to admit to that, particularly some of the Second World War material. The Spain stuff, because of the letters, you can sort of get a feel of what she's doing as a nurse in Spain and the conditions, because she goes into quite a lot of detail. The language she uses, we don't think she was a member of any political party as such, definitely not Communist Party, but she does use Popular Front language. I mean, quite often she ends in yours in the fight, yours in solidarity, sometimes just yours, and then Madge at the end. But most of the time she's appealing for lots and lots of different medical things, and quite often she lists what she wants. There's a lovely story about an ambulance in which she said, we've got this ambulance that's been shot to pieces. I think it'd be brilliant to take it to the UK and tour it round, because it'd be a great propaganda piece. And that's actually quite, going off the tangent here, that's quite a nice little piece, because Lillian Ermston, who's another local nurse, she actually used that ambulance in Staley Bridge at an AIDS Spain meeting. So there's actually no link between the two women, but there is sort of through this bullet-ridden ambulance, which is quite a nice little story.
But yeah, that is an interesting one. How come so many letters have survived when so little else did? How did her letters?
I suppose because they've been sent to the Spanish Medical Aid Committee, and they were also sent also to a local Manchester doctor actually called Mallinson, and he's got a file. I think he's got a file in Kew. I'm not sure if he's got a box at the Marks Memorial Library, but definitely that she sent stuff to the Spanish Medical Aid Committee, so they would have kept letters from her, and also there's some in Mallinson's file. Right.
So yeah, the value of archives very, very strongly coming out here. Obviously, we have, I've put in the chat, we have a very small biography file on Madge, but there's not much in there, is there? I know you'd have seen it, which is a shame. But it's good to know that you pulled all this together. Obviously, we do have a copy of Chris's book in the collection, and you're very welcome to come and read that. And you can read a lot about people like Mary Slater. Nurse Mary Slater from Preston, that we have got a lot of material about, but yeah, little about Madge itself. So it's an important story that you've unearthed, and it's great that we have it now in the collection, and that others of you can get your copy. Yes, if we'd been able to do this in person, then we would have asked Chris to bring copies for sale. But yeah, if you want to get them, we would encourage you to look at many sites where you might be able to get to buy books from.
I mean, yes. Lynette's got my email address. I have got a small number. If anybody wants to email me, yes, I'm quite happy to send you a copy.
Right. Oh, brilliant. That's a good offer. Okay. Yeah. Drop us a line at the library if you would like to take up that offer. Does anybody want to wave at me now? Yes, we have got. I think it's Yeah, Lewis, I'll come to you in a minute. I'm just looking at what I think is probably David's. Can you say a bit more about the archives collections you accessed? I am researching another nurse, so fishing for ideas. Yeah, it's Janet. Yeah.
Right. Mark's Memorial Library is, for Madge, was essential, as well as Warwick University Archive. So you've actually got the hard copies of some of the letters at Mark's Memorial. The Warwick University ones are online. Both are very good. I mean, you have to ask permission, obviously, to use them, but in both cases, I was given permission to use them for nothing, as long as, obviously, you cite them properly. Again, same with the French ones, as long as you actually cite them, they're quite happy for you to use them. With Madge, it was just getting tiny snippets of information. For example, from the French Resistance one, the sort of information you'd get would be, there was, in 1944, they disbanded all the different networks, resistance networks, because obviously the Germans were being driven out and they wanted the regular army to take over. So it's like the disbandment of Alexandra network, and you see who the different people are, and obviously Madge is there, and then there's like brief details about her. There's a few letters as well. There was one where she wanted to get out of Marseille to the north of France, and she had to send a letter to the local police department to say that she hadn't been a collaborator, and in fact she'd actually been resistance. So basically she had to prove that she'd actually done something before they let her move out of Marseille. But yeah, it's some cases you get like a few lines, like one of the things in one of the French ones, it's like, when did she separate from Wilhelm Holst? We don't actually know. But in the very last one in 1944, my French is awful, so apologies for the pronunciation. Supposedly she was called, was it célibataire, which I think means single woman or not married. So now that was put in the last, I think it was around about August 44. So obviously by that stage she wasn't married to him, or they'd separated at least. So from that you have to surmise that sometime round about then, obviously they'd broken away. And then you can find out information about Wilhelm in regards to his dodgy dealings, and you think, we haven't got an exact reason, her saying, well, I broke from him because of that, but I suppose you can surmise that might have been a reason. So yes, in some cases there had to be some educated guesswork, to be honest, particularly about the Second World War team.
Yeah,
go on, Janet.
No, just thank you for that. It's I haven't had a chance to get to Mark's Memorial yet because of the lockdown that just kept me out of London for a while, but I'm hoping to get down there at some stage.
Which nurse are you?
Her name's Molly Murphy. Her letters, she was Jack Murphy's wife.
Yeah.
Her letters are in the People's History Museum in Manchester, so I've accessed all of her letters.
There is a biography of it. Oh, she wrote it.
And her biography is there, and I've got Ralph Darlington's edited version as well. But I'm hoping I can find some people's letters home where they refer to her, as you say, the odd line, just an odd line in the letter, because there's most of what I know is what she wrote herself.
Yeah,
so actually trying to find anything else that anybody else wrote that isn't a direct quote from the stuff she wrote herself is really, really difficult. And
she's also an older nurse, wasn't she?
She was indeed. She was well in her 40s. She was
Madge was seen as quite old, and she was early in 30s.
Your nurse was 14 years younger.
Yeah.
So yes, Molly was really quite old, unusually so. One of the oldest nurses that went out. Yeah. Thank you very much.
It's all right now.
Greatly looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you. Molly's mentioned in the book.
Even better. I would have bought it anyway.
But no new information, I'm afraid.
That's okay. No worries. Okay. Thank you.
That is interesting. See the amount of level of detail that people have to go to the amount of stuff you have to read to finally get that little quote. And at last there she is. So yeah, good luck, Janet. And that's an interesting insight. And a lot of this material is still not. I know Modern Records Centre have digitized a lot of their Spanish Civil War material, haven't they? But a lot of it, when you went to France, so that you had to go to France to see that, did you?
French archives are the queue's better in regards to digitalized archives, but the French, not only is it badly organized, in some cases it's nearly all non-digitalized. I mean, I was lucky that Ollie was traveling. His book was written by a Norwegian journalist called Sigrun Slapgard, who I didn't know, but actually is a bit of a Kate Addy of Norwegian TV. If there was a crisis, she was usually there as a reporter and journalist. So I think she had some sort of grant to research Wilhelm. So we had an agreement that they would, when they went to the various places, they would do the research for Madge as well at the same time, which was nice. So I was able to get to London, but Ollie did the research for me, if you like, in Paris. But Paris is very difficult. You have to know exactly what it is you're looking for and the exact records. Otherwise, it is very difficult. Q, again, yeah. To be honest, everything I looked at was paper format. There was no, the records, the SOE files were all paper-based. Literally, you have to register. You can only have a pencil. I mean, fortunately, with mobile phones now, you are allowed to take, you can take as many pictures as you want. But obviously, you can't just reproduce them all. You have to obviously write permission and so forth. But at least if there's important pieces of information, you can actually take the picture. So that is obviously really a form of digitalization, I suppose.
Yes, well, we certainly allow that because it actually, it saves us doing a lot of scanning, which actually potentially is more damaging to the material as well. So
you don't have to use
people
flash,
are welcome for private research purposes to take their own photos as long as they're not using a flash. So, yeah. Makes sense, really. Lois, you wanted to ask a question. Do you want to unmute yourself? You need to unmute yourself.
I never learn, do I? Here we go. I've recently met, for people interested in the French resistance and women, Anne Seber's book, Les Parisiennes, features women very similar to Madge Addy. As I've learned, I know nothing about Madge Addy. She doesn't appear. I've just looked in the index of this book. But similar people like Nur, a nation woman who worked for SOE, and Odette are featured in this book quite extensively. But one major omission from this book, apart from Madge Addy, who ought to be in it, it covers the period 39 to 49, is Josephine Baker, who is only mentioned in one line as an entertainer in pre-war Paris. But she was also one of these resistance spies. She also went to Lisbon with her music. She sort of somehow kept her place in Parisian society through the war years, but she would go to Lisbon with secret information in invisible ink on her manuscript scores, so that it's, and this isn't in this book at all, which is a major omission. And she has recently been recognized by the French and entered the Pantheon. She's the only, I think she's the first Black woman, and there are a few women of any type in that exalted place, yes. But and she got the Croix de Guerre, and she joined the American forces. I mean, she did a very interesting period, yeah, so I was really interested to hear about Madge. It really fits into what I'd heard, yeah.
There's I think about 40 women who served in France with the SOE, and quite several of them actually obviously were killed. There was one American woman who I'll just say briefly called Virginia Hall. She served very early on, and she had lost half a leg in a riding accident prior to the war, and she still crossed the Pyrenees a couple of times on foot.
Oh, wow. There was some fantastic, I mean, Noah was tortured and died in aviation, in Germany. Awful story. There was such bravery, honestly, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, they knew what would happen if they were discovered, yes.
Yeah, like you were saying, it's terrible, yeah.
Whereas the airmen that they hid, the worst that happened to them, they'd be chucked in a prisoner of war camp.
Yes.
While the one who housed them would be
executed
or put in a concentration camp,
Yeah, this is we're in the run-up, of course, to International Women's Day. Our talk next week is our formal International Women's Day talk, but we did position the talk today thinking about it being nearly International Women's Day, and it certainly has been a tribute to an extraordinary range of women, as you say. Helen says, did you try to find any information about what Madge did after the war, e.g. any political involvements? I realise it must have been difficult.
We did some research, but we couldn't find virtually anything. We think it's pretty certain that she stayed in France through the 40s and probably early 50s. She then moved back to London, where it seems she started nursing again. But to be honest, it just seems that she went back. I wouldn't like to use the word mundane in case anybody's been a nurse. Most people watching, but basically she went back to what she did before. And Torquil, who had been a again heroic resistance fighter and in the regular army as well as in the French army during the second war, I think he became a trainer of accountants. So decided to go back from sort of exciting life to maybe not so exciting is sort of an understatement. But I've got a feeling that actually, although it's not very clear, that neither's health was that good. And again, I say when Torquil died, it does look, unfortunately, that because she went back briefly to Manchester to see her family after the Second World War, and it does seem that there was some sort of bust up, or they just didn't like her being married to or having a boyfriend who was, or fiance who was a foreigner by the sounds of it. I mean, it seems like they just couldn't accept it, and so basically she lost all contact with her family. And again, I would think the story almost certainly of her later life would probably be contained in the documents that have unfortunately since been lost, which is very sad to say the least.
Yeah. Folks, I think we may be drawing to a close, but I would encourage you, if you want to say anything, to wave at me. We've had lots of comments, Chris, in the chat. I'll forward them to you, saying great talk, and people either they've read the book and they've really enjoyed it, or they're looking forward to reading it. So I think we are going to draw to a close by saying thank you very much indeed, Chris. It's been absolutely fascinating, genuinely. So yeah, folks, get the book, or come to the library, read the book, and then get the book.
That's the one.
So next week's talk, Wednesday the 9th of March at 2 o'clock, you're most welcome to join us either in person in our annex or again online for an International Women's Day talk by Joanna Williams on the great Miss Lydia Becker. Today's talk has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly, and we'll be putting the link on the event webpage. A reminder again that our talks are free. However, we do encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so. Thanks very much to those of you who do that regularly. A one-off donation is also most welcome, and there's a donate button on our website. Thank you again, and goodbye. Take care. In solidarity, very best wishes from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.